Was Joseph Imhotep? Now, if you haven't read the story of Joseph in Genesis, you should. It's almost half the book of Genesis. Why did Joseph take up so much room? Why? Was the story that important to take up 23 chapters out of 50? Think about it. I mean, God could have said in 2 or 3 chapters what he did over 23 chapters, if you really think about it. He sent a man. That man was Joseph. He had dreams. His family didn't like him. They got rid of him. Went to Egypt. Was a faithful servant. A horny wife tried to get at him. He would not allow it. He was thrown in jail because of her lies. Pharaoh has dreams. Nobody can interpret the dreams. Here comes Joseph to the rescue. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. They had 7 years of plenty, then followed by 7 years of famine. And the most important reason why he was in Egypt in the first place, because God told Abraham, that's what's going to happen. And he sent Joseph to prepare a place for them, for the reception. And Jacob and his family of 70 plus people went down to Egypt. They eventually became slaves after the pharaohs that came on the scene didn't know Joseph any longer. And then Moses came and rescued, through God's power, the children of Israel. I mean, you could have covered that, just say 5 or 6 chapters. But 23 chapters. Why? First of all, we don't have the full impact in the scriptures of what Joseph did in Egypt, besides what we have in the scriptures. And that's more than good enough for me. But the problem is, the naysayers, and even some Christians, are not convinced thoroughly that Joseph even existed. Yeah, it's hard to believe, even Christians, but it's true. It's true. The secular world don't believe that the children of Israel was ever in Egypt, and they don't believe that before they even got there, Joseph was in Egypt. And he became second in power, and the only one who had more power than Joseph was Pharaoh. And Pharaoh treated Joseph like a son. Well, God willing, our biblical detective work, our investigation will cover definitely Joseph, definitely Abraham, and if God willing, Moses in this study, all which at one time or another lived in Egypt, and why that's important to investigate. You read the scriptures, the Hebrew record, all these 3 characters, all these 3 Hebrews made a very important impact, an historical impact on Egypt. But today's historians not only deny the impact they had, they deny their very existence. So you have to ask the question, why? And that's where I'll pick up where I left off, where I was reading from the last time, about 2 weeks ago. So let me just pick up where I left off. The reason for this denial of their existence is archaeological. can we show that archaeologists have been searching for the Hebrews not in the wrong geographical location, but in the wrong historical era? Abraham did not live during Egypt's 12 or 13 dynasties, but rather 1,000 years previous, during the first dynasty. Historians place the era of the first dynasty at 3000 BC and place Abraham at 2000 BC, that 1,000-year gap again. Strangely, this 1,000-year discrepancy between Egypt history and Hebrew history is repeated by the time we arrive at Joseph's era. Joseph ruled in Egypt in the 3rd and 4th dynasty. Historians place the 3rd dynasty at 2700 BC and place Joseph at 1700 BC. There's that same 1,000-year glitch in time. Excuse me. Moving forward in time, we arrive at Moses' era. He is positively associated with Egypt's 6th dynasty. Today's historians, at least those still admitting that Moses really existed, places the 6th dynasty 1,000 years earlier than their Moses of dynasty 20, 1250 BC. They place the 6th dynasty at 2250 BC. That's the 1,000-year discrepancy again. Let me read you from another author. History, or Egyptian history, is wrong. And why should it matter? The sandy foundations of ancient history. So let's look at it. The academic discipline of ancient history has been built upon foundations made of sand. Literally, the sinking sands of Egypt. As a result, the study of ancient history has crumbled into incoherence. Other ancient histories, those of ancient Greece, for example, such as in the so-called Minoan period, are keyed off of Egypt's chronology. Conventional Egyptian chronology determines the earliest Egyptian cultures began around 3100 BC. This is inconvenient for the proponents of biblical chronology because this would have been around the death of Adam, a few hundred years before Noah's flood. The conventional chronology dates the Exodus to the 1200 BCs. This is because they tie the name of the city mentioned in Exodus 1:11, Ramses, to Ramses II, whom we date to have lived in the 1200s BC. The Bible gives us enough information in just a few verses to precisely date the Exodus to within 1 or 2 absolute years. The key verse is in 1 Kings 6:1. Let's read it. 1 Kings 6:1. What does that say? Let's go find out. That reads, "And it came to pass in the 480th year," so 480 years, "after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Sif, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So, the key verse in 1 Kings 6:1, which tells us that Solomon began building his temple 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign. Now in 2 Chronicles, let's go to 2 Chronicles. Chapter 3, verse 1. "Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father in the place that David had prepared in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And he began to build in the 2nd day of the 2nd month in the 4th year of his reign." Once again, verifying it was the 4th year of Solomon's reign. And back to 1 Kings, we find that Solomon's reign lasted 40 years. Well, let's just read it so you have all the references. 2 Kings 11. Go there quickly. Verse not 2 Kings, 1 Kings, excuse me. I misspoke. 1 Kings chapter 11. Verse 42, I believe. Yes. And at that time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. So we have 3 dates here. 480 years after the children of Israel left Egypt, Solomon began the temple in his what? His 4th reign. And we know Solomon's reign lasted 40 years. You have, I believe, that confirmation also in 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Verse 30. And Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. And Ezekiel tells us that there were 390 years between the division of the monarchy and the fall of Jerusalem. Now, I'm not going to have time to get to where I want to get tonight to go all these verses, but you could write it down. Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. And Ezekiel tells us there were 390 years between the division of the monarchy and the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. And then the final deportation, which we know when we studied the Last Day series, was in 583 BC. Adding that up, we get 586 plus 390 plus 40 minus 3 plus 480 equals 1493 BC. That was the approximate date of the Exodus. Now, I know some of you right now that heard the Great Pyramid teaching from somewhere else or read some of the books. Remember, some time back ago, I said some dating in the Great Pyramid needs to have a readjustment. Well, what are you saying? What kind of adjustment? Well, if I ever get on that topic, I'll tell you when and why and how. But just take my word for it. I haven't led you astray yet. Adjustments need to be made. From all the books that were written, not so much when you get to the Great Hall, the Queen's Chambers, the King. Well, when you get to the King's Chamber, some adjustments need to be made there too, but most of the ascending passages is not a problem. Where the dating, this much I'll give you, becomes skewed is the dating that is done when calculating some of the main descending passage. That's all I'll give to you for now. So adding that up, we get 586 plus 390 plus 40 minus 3 plus 480 equals 1493 BC. That was the approximate date of the Exodus. This is a difference of over 200 years in terms of the conventional chronology. When describing the enormous size of the Israelite population and devastating socioeconomic effects an event like the Exodus would have created, it assures us that no evidence has been found that indicates Egypt ever suffered such a demographic economic catastrophe. This is deceptive, though, because what they really mean is no evidence have been found of such an event occurring in the 12th century BC. So why the discrepancy? The issue in theory is simple. Ancient Egyptians did not believe in linear time. They believed history was cyclical, an eternal balance ebbing and flowing between chaos and order. As civilization broke down, this gave rise to chaos, which was a frightening but also fertile ground for rebirth and the renewal of order. When Egypt made lists of rulers and recorded how long their rule lasted, they were not necessarily documenting a procession from A to B to C as we do in the modern era, more linear in other words, as with our presidents, for example. When we speak of the 43rd president, we mean that he was the 43rd in line. To the Egyptians, however, the 43rd president might have overlapped his rule with the 30th. We would never say our 43rd president ruled at the same time as our 30th. Linear time is a Hebrew concept that was bequeathed to Christianity. Christianity believes time matters because history is important. It is linear in the sense that there was a definite beginning, creation, and there will be a definite end, the day of judgment that coincides with the resurrection of the dead. Christ was born, died, and resurrected into history. What we might call the middle, this is why civilizations influenced by Judaism or Christianity tend to keep detailed historical records. Christianity believes in steady progress over time. Documenting history helps to trace it. Modern historians are humanists. That means they tend to strip the religious framework away from ancient history. Their emphasis on Thales, Thales, as the first true philosopher reveals their bias. They consider him to be the first naturalistic philosopher, one who looked to nature and man's reasoning abilities alone to explain reality instead of appealing to religion. The Hebrews had already developed a complex philosophy thousands of years before Thales ever arrived on the scene. It's just not counted because they say those discussions belong in the religion department, not the history or philosophy department. In stripping away the religious framework of the ancients, they miss or suppress the religious motivations present in even philosophers like Aristotle, who believed homosexuality was critical to a man's education. The Greeks worshipped the city-state. Plato, for example, was motivated to develop a systematic philosophy that unified metaphysics and ethics for the express purpose of training people to produce a better state. All people served the state. A righteous state was one that was founded upon justice. The principles of justice were discerned using reasoning and restraint as opposed to giving in to the appetites, desires, or indulging in sensuous pleasures. To teach people to be better citizens, to use the reason and restraint required educating the masses. The unity of the polis was more important than individual liberty. Socrates subjected himself to an unjust execution because of his belief that membership in and submission to the state were ultimate. The impulse was religious, and so the so-called neutral approach of secular humanists and academics remained religious. Their faith in the healing properties and the restorative qualities of the modern state. They believe in salvation through politics, manifested in a periodic covenant renewal ceremony that sweeps the nation in 4-year political cycles, each growing to an ecstatic fever pitch before finally extinguishing the public crowning of a new commander. Some things never change, do they? The most important aspect of all this Masonic character of American education, where the hopes of individual redemption and salvation are placed in the promises of public education to create the ideal American man, forming the image of the state and cultivated to serve the state. This faith remains strong even in the face of year-over-year declines in test scores and education quality. The consequence of this modern faith has been chaos in the brickyard. Government interference in the economy has distorted the price of information. Government funding of academia, backed by the deepest purse the world has ever known, and one pack full of stolen taxpayer cash, has played a hand in creating a glut of would-be archaeologists and historians. Professors fight for their fair share of the stolen loot, so they publish lest they perish. But to get the money, their discoveries, and listen, this is important here. But to get their money, their discoveries must be consistent with the secular, humanist precipice, I can't even say the word, of the modern state, or the humanist views of the modern state. Else they are like Mary Schweitzer, who, upon their published discovery that dinosaur bones aren't actually millions of years old, had her career sidelined for a time until she repented of her early mistakes and brought her data in line with acceptable scholarly opinion. In other words, you have to see what they see. They'll keep funding you. They'll keep supporting you. But they have to agree with your research. And if your research is something other than what they can agree upon, they'll cut you off. And these professors, these archaeologists, these historians don't want their research funding to be cut off. They don't want their support to be cut off. They want to keep teaching. They want to have a job. So knowing that they're supported by the government, what do you think is going to happen? They'll just say and do what the government wants them to say. Saying what they want them to see, instead of delivering the truth. Because of their secular bias, modern academics have ignored the religious aspect of ancient Egypt and applied our modern dating methods to their ancient records. I'll repeat that again. Because of their secular bias, modern academics have ignored the religious aspect of ancient Egypt and applied our modern dating techniques to their ancient records. In biblical scholarship, we call this eisegesis, which means importing preconceived ideas and schemes and imposing them upon the text instead of reading the text in light of its original context. The truth becomes lost, buried beneath a pile of pretext used to construct a prima facie fairy tale intended to support the myth that man is the measure of all things. The result is a stacked Egyptian chronology that has distorted the actual historical timeline. As Velikovsky put it in the introduction of The Age in Chaos, imagine someone inserting 600 years of time into British timeline while preserving those of American Europe. Quote, as Columbus discovered America in 1942, the Winston Churchill of 1341 could not have visited this country, but must have visited some other land. The scholars will be divided in their opinion as to the whereabouts of that land and met its chief. Another chief, not Franklin Delano Roosevelt of Washington, would live in history as a co-signer of a charter with Churchill of Britain in 1341. But as American records would speak of Churchill, who crossed the ocean in the early 40s of the 20th century, British history would also have Churchill the second 600 years after the first one. Both world wars be fought twice. On and on these distortions could go. You get the picture. This is kind of a distortion facing Egyptian chronology and the other cultures of the ancient world which have been key to it. The distortions are created by errors of interpretation introduced by modern archaeologists and historians. Some of you have seen this, by the way. A documentary was released in 2014 called The Patterns of Evidence, Exodus. It serves as a great introduction to problems with Egyptian chronology and the needs for reconstruction. It's not bad. I think everybody should watch it. It was produced by a Christian, but it's not heavy-handed. It offers a restrained approach to examining the evidence. It always begins by introducing the modern and prevailing viewpoint, a criticism of some piece of evidence that refutes the possibility that the Exodus happened as described in the Bible. Then it cross-examines the prevailing viewpoint. The results are shocking. The production is masterful and amplifies this proverb. Proverbs 18:17. The first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Three of the evidence offered a stepping off point for anyone who wants to dig deeper after the documentary is over. 1, the statue and pyramidal tomb of Joseph discovered in Goshen. 2, the Ipuwer papyrus. And 3, Jericho. The papyrus records a great calamity overtaken Egypt. In fact, it seems to be an eyewitness account of a poet who wrote about the 10 plagues. If I have time, we'll review that, by the way. It contains close parallels with the Exodus account, preserving phrases like the river is blood, the land is not light, and the children of princes are dashed against the wall. The similarity is uncanny. It is dismissed as a plausible record of the Israelites in Egypt on the basis of the dates. The original is thought to have been composed between 1850 BC and 1600 BC, and the Exodus is said to have happened in the 1200 BCs. The remains and evidence of Jericho are also re-examined. Early German and British archaeologists thought they had validated the biblical account, but Kathleen Kenyon, based on her research in the 1950s, contradicted them. Her conclusion has remained entrenched in academia. Her reason for denying that Jericho was destroyed by Joshua. The dates were wrong. What happened in Jericho, she concluded, happened much earlier than Exodus. Once again, bad dating techniques will cause that problem. The problem is the Egyptian chronology. The reason it is so easy to deny the evidence of the Exodus exists is because scholars rely on a lack of corroborating evidence between the relative chronologies of the Bible and ancient Egypt. One of those histories is wrong, and one isn't. Egyptian chronology has been distorted by biased researchers. Their interpretations of the facts are intended to undermine the authority of the Bible by contradicting its claims against the actual historical evidence. These so-called discoveries undermine the faith of those Christians who are subjected to this viewpoint in public school, college, and adulthood. The academics accomplish this effect by assuming Egyptian history is the correct foundation upon which all other ancient chronologies should stand. They lean on a weak reed. As the cost of information falls into the digital age and access to the internet and diversity of news sources spreads, the old gatekeepers are gradually losing control over the flow of information. This is beginning to undermine their authority. It will continue to do so. Isaiah's old words remain, "Lo, thou trusted in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt. Whereupon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh's king of Egypt to all that trust in him." Isaiah 36:6. Other individuals relying on independent wealth who do not need the salaries or tenureships promised by university systems have been eroding confidence in the prevailing viewpoint since at least the 1950s. Emmanuel Velikovsky initiated this process with his book Age and Chaos in 1952. Donovan Corville extended it with his book The Exodus Problem in 1971. Others has also picked up the torch starting in the mid-1980s. And the torch they're picking up is scholars and historians, academia, want to keep driving the point concerning their inaccurate timelines. And now, even though it's getting harder and harder to defend that position, but you have an Islamic world and Egyptian historians that literally get insulted and offended. And God forbid we insult or offend their history. First of all, it's not their history. It's not an Islamic history. If anything, they want to say it's a moon god history, but not an Islamic history. Well, I got news for you. Joseph arrived in the land as a prisoner, became second to Pharaoh in power and authority, and the Hebrews did come into that land. Not in the dates. Both Christian and non-Christians have been perpetuating for many, many decades now. Now, we're going to correct that. We're going to set our own timelines. And it has nothing to do with the present chronology timelines that are available in history books and other research papers that are totally inaccurate. I'll have more to say about that as I continue reading and we keep digging into the scriptures. But don't forget, we can date when the Exodus happened. It's harder to date things prior to the flood. But after the flood, especially as we get closer and closer, especially to David's era, to get a more accurate timeline than the one that's been presented to us for far too long. 1493, give or take a few years BC, is when the Exodus happened. And I know some of you will have written in your Bibles, written in your Great Pyramid books, or any other books that you might be studying, a different date. It's time, maybe not in this study, but soon, to look into those dates and see why that's not even accurate. And if that's not accurate, what else does it throw off down the line? Well, we'll see, God willing. But let's get through with Joseph and Imhotep, which will cover, God willing, Joseph, Abraham, Joseph, and I'm really hoping Moses. And there's a few surprises in this teaching that you've never heard before. But we'll keep plugging away at it every Wednesday night. And if you're interested, I want to hear from you that you are interested. Play a song.